Spring 1979 was supposed to be the season of liberty. Iranian society waited for reforms. Instead, they got a sequence of executions that permanently fractured the social landscape. How fast did the celebration turn into terror? It took only weeks after the monarchy fell. Soon, these promises of justice would end with rifles cracking on the roof of the Rafah school. But before the blood, there was noise. In January, the Shah fled. Tehran exploded. Car horns blared for days without stopping. Strangers embraced on the boulevards, a nation in euphoria. Then came February. The frequency changed. The joyous honking was replaced by the heavy silence of a curfew. The new leadership moved instantly. They didn't prioritize a parliament. They prioritized punishment. A legal machine was constructed overnight to purge the old elite. Revolutionary guards stormed the ministries in downtown Tehran and seized control of the state. The new power did not hide these seizures. It broadcast them. Tehran, late February 1979. Citizens gathered at newsstands for the morning edition of Kayhan, or Etala'at. The headline was secondary. The focus was the image. Grainy, black and white, high contrast. A row of bodies lay on a morgue slab or slumped against a wall. Generals, ministers, the Shah's inner circle. The ink was barely dry. People stared at the visual proof of a world turned upside down. These images did not stay in the paper. Supporters cut them out. They pasted photographs of shot officials on walls and shop windows like cinema posters. The death toll rose into the dozens. The shock was intentional. The revolution used the press to prove that the old gods were mortal and dead. The Revolutionary Council justified the haste as the only way to prevent a monarchist coup. To prevent a coup, the new regime turned to the headlines. The focal point was Qasr prison. A bitter irony defined the structure. This fortress was built by the monarchy to crush political dissent. Now, it was crushing the monarchists. The stone walls remained the same. Only the prisoners had swapped places. By 7 in the morning, newsstands in Tehran were under siege. A low buzz of disbelief moved through the crowds on the sidewalks. Commuters held up fresh copies of Kayhan and Etala'at. The front pages did not carry official statements. They carried photographs of dead bodies. Grainy, black and white proof that the old order was physically gone. The prison operated as a central sorting facility. Security forces swept through the provinces, but high-value targets were transported to the capital. The legal machinery inside Qasr was stripped to the frame. No defense attorneys, no jury selection. The path from the interrogation room to the brick wall of the courtyard was direct. The shots echoed, then stopped. Inside the prison walls, ordinary justice ceased to exist. In its place, operated a hastily assembled tribunal. February 1979, Tehran. To dismantle the monarchy, the new leadership established the Islamic Revolutionary Courts. These bodies rejected the slow machinery of civil law. No filing systems, no preliminary hearings, no bail. The meticulous bureaucracy of the previous era dissolved into immediate action. Why such extreme haste? The Revolutionary Council calculated that a drawn-out legal process would allow the Shah's loyalists to reorganize. Every hour spent on investigation was an hour given to the enemy. The priority shifted from establishing guilt to eliminating threats. Complex jurisprudence collapsed into binary decisions. In this vacuum of procedure, credentials did not matter. The committee appointed judges on the spot without vetting. This judicial void found its operator in one man, a cleric named Sadeq Khalkhali. He possessed no background in civil jurisprudence. His authority stemmed solely from religious seminaries and absolute loyalty to Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. That was enough. Khalkhali brought a specific terror to the bench. Witnesses remembered his thick-rimmed glasses and a constant small smile. He wore it while sending men to the firing squad. The proceedings moved at breakneck speed. In the bazaars and homes of Tehran, locals gave him a new name. They whispered it in secret: the hanging judge. Once a prisoner entered his courtroom, the chance of survival dropped to near zero. Khalkhali did not wait for the prisoners to come to him. He moved the court directly to the cells. The epicenter of this purge was Evin prison, Was there a chance for acquittal? The room gave the answer before the session began. No defense table, no file of evidence, no lawyer. The process functioned like a conveyor belt. A prisoner was shoved into the room. He heard a single phrase, "War against the people." Before he could speak, the verdict was delivered. The silence in the hall was absolute. No objections interrupted the judge. No witnesses were called to the stand. Only the sound of breathing and the scratch of a pen filled the air. Just months earlier, Evin was the Shah's dungeon for poets and revolutionaries. Now, the same concrete cells held the ministers and generals who built them. The tribunal viewed complex investigations as unnecessary delays. Guilt was not something to be proven. It was assumed by rank. Service to the monarchy was the crime. Guards walked down the hallway with a clipboard. They read a fresh list of names. The former masters of Tehran stood up and walked toward the door. Inside Evin, the courtroom became a processing center. Verdicts were stamped out with industrial efficiency. The mechanics were identical for every defendant. Former ministers and military commanders stood before the tribunal without legal counsel. The charges were standardized: corruption on earth, collaboration with SAVAK. The entire procedure took less than 60 minutes. It was shorter than a standard government lunch break. This speed became the new social norm within the prison walls. The internal courtyards lost their function as recreation spaces. They became logistical endpoints. The condemned were marched directly from the bench to the open air. In the yard, the firing squads loaded their chambers. The first to enter this rapid mechanism on February 15, 1979, was a man whose name alone induced tremors: Nematollah Nassiri. Who was the primary target? The architect of the Shah's police state, the head of SAVAK. Guards dragged him from the holding cell. He could barely stand. His face was a ruin of purple bruises and dried blood. Heavy bandages swathed his neck. The former general, once the absolute master of Tehran's shadows, looked broken. They shoved him toward the wall. No blindfold, just the glare of flashbulbs and the black eyes of rifles. For years, Nassiri commanded an empire of fear. Thousands of informants, wiretaps in hotel lobbies, agents in university classrooms. He oversaw a network that turned neighbors into spies and silence into survival. But the network vanished. The order was given. A single volley tore through the night air. Nassiri fell. The man responsible for the systematic eradication of dissent was dead. But Nassiri did not die alone. Beside him stood three generals who represented the absolute physical force of the monarchy. General Reza Naji, the military governor who enforced martial law during the 1978 uprisings. He was the mechanism of control against the strikes. Next was General Mehdi Rahimi, the police commander of Tehran who managed the capital's security until the final collapse. Finally, General Manouchehr Khosrodad, the leader of the elite army aviation helicopter units and a central pillar of the armed forces. Their simultaneous trial dismantled the military hierarchy in minutes. The Revolutionary Court bypassed all legal defense. The sentence was immediate. The generals were moved from the courtroom to the execution site without delay. The volley destroyed the chain of command. The revolution began its morning with 4 corpses on the courtyard asphalt. The destruction of the army was only the first step. The revolution next targeted the civilian patriarch of the regime, Amir-Abbas Hoveyda. He was the face of the state's daily operation. He served as prime minister from 1965 to 1977, 12 years. This was the longest tenure in modern Iranian history, a record that vanished the moment the handcuffs clicked. For an entire generation, Hoveyda represented the permanence of the system. He oversaw the economy. He directed diplomacy. His arrest sent a clear signal to the elite. No one was safe. Hoveyda did not flee the country. He remained in Tehran. The Revolutionary Guards took him into custody immediately. For months, the former prime minister waited in a cell for the committee to determine his future. On April 7, 1979, the man who managed the government for 13 years entered a crowded courtroom. Yesterday, he was the second most powerful figure in the empire. Today, he sat on a folding chair in a makeshift tribunal. How long does it take to condemn a prime minister? A few hours. The atmosphere inside the hall was suffocating. Guards with G3 rifles stood shoulder to shoulder against the walls. Spectators squeezed onto wooden benches, leaning forward to see the fallen giant. The air smelled of sweat and stale tobacco. A low hum of voices filled the space. It stopped only when the judge spoke. Amir-Abbas Hoveyda had held his post for 13 years. It was a record for modern Iran. For a generation, he was the civilian face of the state. Now, that longevity was the primary evidence against him. The trial was a public spectacle. Cameras flashed. The prosecution did not present complex legal arguments. They presented a narrative of betrayal, corruption on earth, war against God. Hoveyda tried to use logic. The court required only submission. The outcome was written before the session began. The verdict arrived before dusk. Death. Guards led him out to a small courtyard behind the building immediately. An officer pulled the trigger. Hoveyda's death that evening rewrote the rules for the entire elite. April 1979. The news hit Tehran with the force of a physical blow. A former prime minister was not just removed, he was erased. The international community sent cables of condemnation. The revolutionary courts ignored them. The shock was social. It was the realization that the list of targets had no bottom. Generals died for giving orders. Hoveyda died for his title. His execution signaled that the purge was no longer about specific crimes. It was about the system itself. Fear cascaded down the hierarchy. Every deputy minister and district manager understood the new reality. If the man at the top could be shot in a courtyard, their own anonymity offered no protection. The political leadership was gone. The prosecutors turned their attention to the intelligence network. The names uncovered in the government archives did not stay secret. By sunrise, they were headlines. Why make the bloodshed public? To turn fear into a daily utility. Revolutionary committees descended into the ministry basements while the city slept. Flashlights cut through the dust. Steel cabinets were forced open with crowbars. Inside lay the administrative soul of the Pahlavi dynasty. Thousands of dossiers, payrolls, and surveillance logs. Investigators didn't need complex forensics. Every signature was a confession. Every stamped document was a death warrant. The evidence traveled straight from the archives to the typesetters. The rotary presses at etched spun at maximum speed throughout the night. Ink soaked into cheap paper. By dawn, the stacks were bundled and thrown onto delivery trucks. Tehran woke up to the rhythm of the news cycle. Citizens gathered at street kiosks before work. They didn't buy the paper for politics. They bought it to see who was left. The front pages carried the seal of the Revolutionary Courts. Below the headlines, the layout offered a grainy black and white horror. Photographs taken inside the prison courtyards. Bodies slumped against brick walls. The flash of the camera reflecting off pools of dark liquid on the pavement. It was a deliberate spectacle. The monarchy was not just being dismantled, it was being erased in real time, frame by frame. Supporters of the Ayatollah saw these images as the final victory over tyranny. But for the average shopkeeper, teacher, or clerk, the message was different. The photos proved that the new law had no breaks. People read the captions, folded the paper, and said nothing. The organization whose archives were now public property began in 1957. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi needed eyes in every room. The CIA and Mossad provided the blueprints. Together, they built SAVAK. It started as a security agency. It became a social disease. Fear seeped into tea houses, university classrooms, and family dinners. Trust evaporated. People stopped speaking freely. A neighbor might be a patriot, or he might be on the payroll. By the mid-70s, the official roster listed over 5,000 full-time agents. But the real weight came from the shadows. An undefined ocean of informants, fully mobilized by 1978. One of the architects of this surveillance machine was General Hassan Pakravan. He did not fit the profile of a butcher. Archive footage shows him in impeccable European suits at diplomatic receptions. Soft-spoken, educated in France. a man who discussed philosophy as easily as security protocols. But there was a disconnect. This refined intellectual designed the skeleton of the police state. From 1961 to 1965, Pakrovon professionalized the agency. Later directors added the sadism. He added the efficiency. He built the structure that tracked every whisper of opposition against the Shah. The nuance did not matter to the crowds in the streets. In February 1979, the revolution came for its architect. Armed men located the general and took him into custody. Diplomatic ties, fluent French, years of dedicated service. None of it mattered in April 1979. Pakrovon was dragged before the Islamic Revolutionary Court in Tehran. The proceedings were not a legal debate. They were a conveyor belt. The prosecution did not waste time on specific instances of torture. What was the charge against the man who simply signed the paperwork? The construction of the police state itself. The verdict was immediate. Guilty. Pakrovon was not an isolated case. In those same weeks, the tribunals condemned dozens of senior officers to the wall. The purge was systematic. On April 11th, the revolution executed the former director of SAVAK by firing squad. The firing squads worked overtime, but the prisons held only a fraction of the threat. Outside the walls, a massive machine remained intact. Morning roll call at the bases looked identical to the month before. Rows of pressed olive drab, thousands of boots hitting the asphalt in unison. To the new leadership, this symmetry was terrifying. It wasn't discipline, it was a loaded weapon. The Imperial Army was a titan. 400,000 men, the fifth largest military force on the planet. They had the tanks, they had the phantoms, and until yesterday, they had the Shah. In the corridors of the Rafah school, paranoia suffocated the victory. Ruhollah Khomeini knew the history of the 20th century better than his advisors. Revolutions don't die of old age. They die by the coup. A single order from a charismatic general could turn those rifles around. The new government wouldn't last an afternoon. Fear dictated the strategy. The executions of early 1979 were not just punishment, they were a broadcast. By lining up the Shah's top brass against the wall, the court sent a violent frequency to every officer still wearing a uniform. The signal arrived at the garrisons before the blood had even dried. It traveled through the grainy photos in morning newspapers and the terrified whispers in the mess halls. 4 names echoed off the concrete walls: Nematollah Nassiri, Mehdi Rahimi, Reza Naji, Manouchehr Khosrodad. Yesterday, they were the untouchable gods of the Imperial Army. Today, they were examples. Inside the bases, 400,000 men understood the new reality. Every major and colonel faced a binary choice: die for a monarch who had already fled, or submit to the cleric who held the gun. The purge was swift. Within months, 10,000 officers were stripped of their ranks, forced into retirement, or sent to the tribunals. The institution didn't fight back. It adjusted. Men who had spent careers saluting the Shah suddenly memorized revolutionary slogans. Others simply stopped talking. They ripped the imperial insignias off their shoulders and waited. The 5th largest military in the world didn't need to be defeated on the battlefield. It was neutralized by the sound of a firing squad. The barracks went quiet. Those who wore Italian suits instead of uniforms understood the signal just as clearly. They did not wait for a summons. They drove straight to Amir-Abbas airport. What do you take when you leave forever? You take only what fits in a single suitcase. The departures hall became a holding pen for the ancien regime. Ministers, architects, and oil tycoons stood shoulder to shoulder in the humid crush. Outside, Mercedes sedans sat at the curb with keys still in the ignition. Owners abandoned them like used tissues. Inside, the constant roar of jet engines drowned out the panic. Every takeoff marked a life cut in half. By the end of 1979, over 100,000 members of the educated elite had fled the country. This was not just migration, it was a hemorrhage. They left behind villas in Shemiran and thriving businesses. But the state lost more than assets. It lost its operating system. The Ministry of Economy and the National Iranian Oil Company emptied out. Technocrats vanished. Those who remained went dark. Smoke rose from the gardens of wealthy districts as families incinerated their histories. They erased names, dates, and photographs. They fed the fireplaces until the page count hit 0. By late 1979, the terminals at Amir-Abbas Airport quieted down. The mass exodus of the imperial elite was complete. The nation was already a different geopolitical entity. The legal framework followed the purges. On March 30 and 31, a national referendum took place. The ballot replaced the monarchy with the Islamic Republic of Iran. The tribunals had successfully dismantled the previous administrative class. They cleared the path for a theological hierarchy. Ruhollah Khomeini assumed the title of supreme leader. The transition was absolute. The new constitution of December 1979 granted him lifetime command over the armed forces and the judiciary.